Tonight I'm going to talk about some sort of basic background stuff about language and manuscripts and writing and so on that's important to know. Next week the plan is to get into talking about textual criticism, which is basically the science of reconstructing the original words of a document. And then after that we will look at some specific examples where there's questions about what the word should be, and textual criticism helps us figure out what that word should be. So we're going to look at actual verses as we run through the New Testament. And then we're going to get into the difficulties of translation, some of the questions involved, and why there are so many translations, why there's differences, who different translations are aimed at, that sort of thing, which might help you decide what translation would be best for you. So that's the goal, and we'll see how close we come to finishing by the end of January. So any questions from last week before we get going? Last week we finished off our discussion on the canon of Scripture, where we had talked about initially the books that made it into the Bible, and then we spent about 3 weeks talking about Old Testament and New Testament times books that did not make it into the Bible and why they didn't. So let's get going on tonight. Now some of this might seem pretty basic to some of you, but it might be new to others. And part of the reason I'm doing this, a person who's not here tonight expressed shock to me a few weeks ago when I said the New Testament was written in Greek, because they thought the New Testament was written in Hebrew. So I thought, well, I guess I better talk about this. First I'm going to talk about the languages of the Bible. And Steve, would you do me a favor, pass this around? This is the Old Testament. That was written primarily in Hebrew. So you can see what Hebrew looks like. Hebrew is still spoken in Israel. Most of the books in the Old Testament were written in Hebrew. It's very different than English. It's written from right to left instead of from left to right, and it has sounds that do not occur in English, that if you learn to speak Hebrew it's a little difficult coming up with some of those sounds. And originally Hebrew is written with no vowels, only consonants. Peggy, if you were to write your name in Hebrew it would be PGG.
How would they pronounce it?
Peggy. And so you have to be familiar with the words to figure out what the vowel sounds would be. Hebrews kind of became a bit of a dying language at one point. A group called the Masoretes went back and they invented little markings that they would put around the consonants to help people know how to pronounce it. Because there is a possibility, if you just have consonants, usually the context would help you know what word should be pronounced, but you could pronounce it a different way which might have a different meaning. And so PGG could be pronounced Peggy, but maybe it could be Poga. Who knows, unless you're familiar with it. I took Hebrew when I was in Bible college, and we'll see if I can still remember this. I quoted this to the local rabbi, and he said I had pretty good pronunciation. Genesis 1:1. Bereshit bara Elohim eth hashamayim ve'eth ha'aretz. The ha'aretz hayatha thohu vavohu vahushek el penei. And so that's Genesis 1:1, and I did mess up a little bit there. And there's a sound in there that could be much more guttural, vahushek. Yeah. So I spared you that. The second language in the Old Testament and in the New Testament is Aramaic. Aramaic was spoken in the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, and the Persian Empire, and is still spoken in parts of Syria. It's a relative of Hebrew. They're similar languages, but a little bit different. And so when Jews were surrounded by empires speaking Aramaic, and especially as Jews were transported by the thousands into captivity in these surrounding empires, particularly Assyria and Babylon, when they came back, they were no longer speaking Hebrew, they were speaking Aramaic. At the time, New Testament times, the popular language in Israel was Aramaic. Hebrew became confined to scholarly and religious use. So the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, but the average person was speaking Aramaic at that time. So there are parts of the Old Testament that are not written in Hebrew, they are written in Aramaic. For example, there's parts of Daniel, parts of the book of Ezra, there's some Aramaic phrases and expressions in Genesis and in Jeremiah. In 2 Kings 18, there's an incident recorded, this is in the 8th century BC. King Hezekiah sends some representatives to talk with spokesman of the Assyrian king Sennacherib, and they say, "Speak to your servants in Aramaic, since we understand it." And so they're telling the Assyrian people, we understand Aramaic, talk to us in Aramaic. In Nehemiah complains that the children from mixed marriages, where a Jew married a Gentile, that they couldn't speak Hebrew anymore, they were just speaking Aramaic. Now Aramaic occurs in the New Testament, and there's actually theories that some of the New Testament books, particularly the Gospel of Matthew, was probably written in Aramaic and then translated into Greek. Mark 5:41, Jesus says, and so it's interesting, rather than translate what Jesus said into Greek, they actually preserve what Jesus said in Aramaic. He says, Talitha Kumi, which means little girl, get up. This is when he was raising a girl from the dead. So he spoke to her in Aramaic. In Mark 7:34, Jesus, again it's recorded exactly what he said in Aramaic, Ephatha, which means be opened. And he was praying for somebody to be healed. And then in Matthew 27, while Jesus is on the cross, he speaks in Aramaic, and he says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, from the cross. And then Matthew translates it for us, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And when we are looking at textual variants in a couple of weeks, this is one of them, because some people got confused. What is this? And so they confused what he said because it was written in Aramaic. You may have heard the word Abba before. Abba, Father. Abba is Aramaic, and it means father. There's a church in Belleville that has an Aramaic name. It's called Maranatha. That's an Aramaic word. Yes, John?
And is there any historical evidence that Christ spoke Hebrew or Aramaic?
Well, he spoke Aramaic, but he probably also knew Hebrew, because they're related languages, and he obviously studied the Old Testament and could read the Old Testament, and that would have been written in Hebrew.
So he was bilingual?
At least bilingual, and probably maybe 4 languages: Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and Hebrew would all be circulating at that time. Anyone know what Maranatha means? It's an Aramaic word.
Come quickly?
It means our Lord come.
Or our Lord.
Yeah, so it's along that line. So that's a little unusual, and you guys should get some kind of Aramaic name here, maybe. I don't know what it'd be. Maybe you could go Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? I don't know. And then the third language we find in the Bible is Greek. And I'll pass around a Greek New Testament. And so this is the language of the New Testament.
Robert, what language is Maranatha? Aramaic?
Aramaic.
Thank you.
As I had mentioned, the Gospel of Matthew might have first been written in Aramaic and then translated into Greek, because it's thought that he wrote for Jewish people, and so if he was writing for the people of Israel, he would write it in Aramaic because that's what they spoke. But outside of Israel, most Israelites could speak Greek, but especially as you went outside of Israel, then everyone spoke Greek. There are patterns of speech recorded in the New Testament that reflect Hebrew patterns of speech, as if something was originally written in Hebrew, then translated into Greek. And so one example is in Luke 2:1, where it says, in the fullness of time. That's the way a Hebrew would say a phrase. A Greek wouldn't say that. Wouldn't express it like that. But I wanted to mention, actually, I got ahead of myself. A Hebrew pattern of speech is, he cried out saying. A Hebrew would say it like that. And then the fullness of time thing is a different thing. I wanted to comment on this, that a number of things come together, and it's interesting. Luke 2:1 says, in the fullness of time. And then it talks about Jesus coming, the birth of Jesus. And so a couple aspects of in the fullness of time, some things that existed that up until then had not existed on planet Earth. And so that this was a prime time for the Messiah to come. Number one, Alexander the Great had conquered most of the known world. He lived from 356 to 323 BC. He died when he was 33 years old. By 33, he had conquered the whole world. Basically, everything that could be conquered, he had conquered it. And as a result of that, by the 1st century AD, the time of the New Testament, basically everybody in the known world could speak Greek. The Greek Empire had spread the Greek language, and so it was like the universal language. Nowadays, it would be English for the most part. Most people that are involved in business, etc., around the world, at least have some knowledge of English, if you're involved with computers and email and all of that. At that time, it was Greek. This made it possible, for the first time in history, you could travel quite a ways around the known world, and you could speak one language, and most people could understand you. That had never existed in history before. The second thing that happened was Augustus Caesar was crowned as the first official emperor of the Roman Empire in 27 BC. The Roman Empire had kind of existed prior to that, but there were lots of infighting and so on. Julius Caesar was headed in that direction and then was assassinated. But 27 BC, you officially have a Roman Empire now. The Roman Empire was tremendously organized. They proceeded to build an empire-wide system of roads and transportation. They brought relative peace to the empire, really for the first time. And so you could actually travel a fair distance, as Paul did, without getting yourself killed. He had enough problems as it was because of his faith. But those two things, a universal language and a relatively peaceful empire where you could actually travel on an actual road and travel all around the Mediterranean, that had never happened before. The Latin language also, of course, started to grow with the Roman Empire, and around the 3rd century BC, or AD, it began to replace Greek as the universal language.
Robert, it's hard for me or for us to think of a culture or a society where there aren't roads. You know, we just grew up with roads everywhere, you know.
Well, think of North America. When settlers came here from Europe, there were footpaths, but there were no roads. Think of early roads. I've seen pictures of these corduroy roads, they were called, where they just laid logs down. They'd be tremendously bumpy. And if you go further north, we're near the old Hastings Road. That was originally just a stagecoach path through the woods sort of thing, and eventually it was paved for the most part. And then I remember talking to a guy who lived north, and he was so upset still decades later when they put Highway 62 in. It bypassed his little village, and the village died because the stagecoach used to stop there, and now nobody went there. The city just died, the village. So, yeah, but that's a key thing. Roman roads are still excavated today, and it's amazing the work they put into making good roads so that goods could travel, people could travel. It never existed before. So Greek is still spoken in Greece today. Like any language, it's evolved and changed over the years. I read an article on Wikipedia about it, and they identified 6 broad periods or categories of the Greek language. The part we're concerned about is called Koine Greek. The word koine means common or shared, and it was a style of Greek between about 330 BC to about AD 550. Of course, in Greece today they speak modern Greek. Now, I studied Greek in Bible college, and I remember I was doing some door-to-door thing, and I came across a Greek lady, and so I tried to speak to her in Koine Greek that I knew, and she couldn't understand anything I was saying because she spoke modern Greek. It's interesting, so the New Testament is written in Koine Greek, and at one time up through the 1800s, it was thought that Koine Greek was some kind of special spiritual type of Greek that only the New Testament was written in, because they hadn't discovered any other documents written in Koine Greek until the early 1900s. And so this is only 100 years ago this happened, that in Egypt they started discovering tens of thousands of documents written in the same Greek as the New Testament. And so they suddenly came to realize, hey, this isn't some weird, special spiritual Greek. This is everyday common language that people spoke for hundreds of years. By finding all these documents, which they were not religious documents necessarily, just letters to your friend and so on, and they found tens of thousands of them. I have a book by a guy named Albert Deisman who studied thousands of these and wrote out sort of the new understanding of words that were in the New Testament that they really didn't know what they meant before, because they could only go by the context. But now, through studying everyday letters, you know, oh, that's what that word means. So it really helped. So a simple, normal, everyday language. It wasn't highfalutin, special language. And so because of all these documents, it really helped tremendously in being able to translate Greek and understanding grammar. And so really, any translation in English of the Greek New Testament prior to the early 1900s is of limited value, because we learned so much about Greek in the last 100 years. Now, of course, English has changed a tremendous amount. Peggy and I go to the Stratford Festival every year. In the last 29 years, we only missed 1 year. Sometimes we will see a play by Shakespeare, and I find, now this is English that's 400 years old. I find it takes me a while to get into being able to comprehend this English. It's like a whole different language, and that's only 400 years ago. Of course, Shakespeare was writing in the common language of his day, but English has changed. In light of the fact that the New Testament was written in normal, everyday, down-to-earth language, it befuddles me that some denominations to this day think we have to speak in an old-fashioned sort of language, like King James language from 400 years ago. That's not how the New Testament was written. They just spoke regular language. And in light of that, I want to share a story about a guy sitting right here. You might have to erase that part from the tape, Tim, in case I get him in trouble. I won't mention the denomination that he visited, but I remember this story, and I believe it was in the 1970s. This happened to Jim, and he visited a church in Picton. It was a pretty conservative church. As I recall, the women sat on one side and the men sat on the other side.
The women sat at the back.
Oh, the women sat at the back. Okay. And at the end of the service, various men were standing up and praying, and so Jim thought he would stand up and pray too. And so he did that. And at the end of his prayer, one of the elders spoke up. He was very angry and upset with Jim, and he rebuked him and said, that prayer was from Satan. It was because Jim did not use King James English. He just used everyday English, and so he didn't say shouldest and canst and thou and thee and ye and so on. And I think later someone explained to him, when you talk to God, you have to use King James English, because that's the only language he understands. Or it was taken to be a sign of respect or something.
Oh my goodness.
In light of the fact of all the documents that were discovered 100 years ago in Egypt, they realized the New Testament was not written in highfalutin English or Greek. It was just normal, everyday language like everyone would
Robert,
talk.
if I remember right, I was accused of blaspheming God because I called him you instead of
The
Thou or me?
the,
Oh,
yeah.
goodness.
And the exact words, I remember it plain as day, I was right beside Jim.
Oh, I didn't know you were there.
Beside the blasphemy, the man says, "The spirit of Satan within you has caused you to pray."
Wow.
As you
Wow.
did. And me with long hair down my back,
Oh,
tried to defend Jim to these people.
Did you get in trouble too then?
Well, they just looked at me, they probably gave up on me, but
now we'll move into a bit of talking about ancient writing and bookmaking. We're leading our way towards talking about the manuscripts of the Bible. So the earliest known examples of writing come from Egypt and Mesopotamia, the region around the Mediterranean, from around 3500 BC. So that's about 5,500 years ago, people were writing. Now in some cases, their writing on manuscripts has faded over the centuries, and scientists can use chemicals to help their writing appear more distinct, or they can use ultraviolet radiation, infrared radiation, X-rays, and computer technology that can help bring some of these things to light. We've already discussed the fact that in the Roman Empire, between 5 to 10% of people could read and write. So that means 90 to 95% of people were illiterate. And so that would be rare in our modern culture. So that's why throughout history, until relatively recent times, there were professional scribes, people who could read and write on behalf of somebody else. The Old Testament mentions a number of these scribes by name. I won't bother, well, I'll just give you some verses where they are. A guy named Shebna is mentioned in 2 Kings 18. A guy named Shaphan is mentioned in 2 Kings 22. Ezra was a scribe. He's obviously mentioned in the book of Ezra and also in Nehemiah. Baruch was a scribe for Jeremiah, and Jeremiah had another scribe named Jonathan. These people could read and write on behalf of other people. Many of the New Testament books were dictated. Probably most of Paul's letters he did not write himself. He spoke them, and a professional scribe wrote it down. And so, for example, I'm going to read you some of these verses. In Romans 16:2, it reads, "I, Tertius, who wrote down this letter, greet you in the Lord." Paul dictated it, and a guy named Tertius wrote it down. In 1 Corinthians 16:21, it says, "I, Paul, write this greeting in my own hand." And so it's at the end of the book, and we'll see this happens a bunch of times. He's dictated the book, a scribe has written it down, and then the last sentence, he says, "Hi, from Paul," and he writes it out in his own handwriting, sort of thing. Galatians 6:11, again at the end of the book, Paul writes, "See what large letters I use as I write to you with my own hand." And so that last sentence, and it's thought from various other things, as well as from some of these, that Paul had bad eyesight. And so this is a clue there. He can't write small letters. In order for him to see it himself, he has to write big letters. And so he says, "See what large letters I use as I write to you with my own hand," this last sentence in the book. Colossians 4:8, again at the end of the book, it reads, "I, Paul, write this greeting in my own hand. Remember my chains, grace be with you." So the last sentence he wrote out himself. 2 Thessalonians 3:17, "I, Paul, write this greeting in my own hand, which is the distinguishing mark in all my letters. This is how I write." And so it's the last sentence. Here's my own personal handwriting. It's like a signature.
What was that scripture? 2 Thessalonians?
3:17.
Thank you.
In Philemon, I get a kick out of the book of Philemon. It's an excellent book. It's a personal letter. If you don't know the story, this guy Philemon had a slave. As I've already said, half the people in the Roman Empire were slaves. And the slave's name was Onesimus. Onesimus ran away. And then he became a Christian. And then somehow he ended up with Paul. And so Paul writes a letter to Philemon on behalf of Onesimus. One of the funniest things where Paul says, I won't mention to you that you owe your very life to me. He just mentioned it. But anyway, he's writing to Philemon. And at the end of the letter, so he had dictated the letter, a scribe wrote it down, and then at the end he says, I, Paul, am writing this with my own hand. I will pay it back, referring to the price for buying Onesimus, not to mention that you owe your very self to me. Not to mention it, but I just mentioned it. Peter also used, and by the way, a scribe of this type is called, the Greek word is an amanuensis. Amanuensis. Peter used an amanuensis as well. In 1 Peter 5:12 it says, through Silvanus, whom I consider a faithful brother, I have written this short letter to encourage you and to testify that this is the true grace of God. Stand fast in it. So Peter dictated it, Silvanus wrote it down. And then the last sentence, Peter writes himself. Here's the materials that writing was written on. Stone, for example, the Ten Commandments were written on stone. Clay tablets, as we see here, one early form of writing was called cuneiform. It had about 600, it's very complicated. Imagine trying to learn this. It had over 600 different signs that would be pressed into wax or wet clay using a little wedge-shaped stick, basically, a wooden stylus. All these little triangular marks that in different combinations mean different things. A very complicated language, but ancient kings kept libraries of records on these clay tablets, and archaeologists still find them today. Archaeologists have found tens of thousands of these, and so in one site in Turkey, they found 10,000 of these clay tablets. In one site in Iraq, they found 20,000 clay tablets with cuneiform writing on them. And in 3 different locations in Syria, they found 58,000 clay tablets like this with cuneiform writing on them. You would have a clay tablet while it's still wet and malleable. You poke it with the stick, and then you bake it in an oven, and it'll last for thousands of years. It's a permanent record. And there's people today who can read this. I'm not one of them. They also found some for longer works. If you didn't want to just put it on a little clay tablet, if you had a lot to say, like a Steve Sweetman sort of guy, then you would use a clay barrel or cylinder where there'd be like a hub in the middle, and you'd put a stick through, and so the barrel could spin on this hub. And so Steve Sweetman could be going at it with his stick, and he could write a whole novel basically on this barrel of wet clay, and then they would bake it and dry it, and they found some things like that. Writing was also done on pottery. And so these were, you might have heard the word potsherd, or it's technically called ostraca. O-S-T-R-A-C-A, ostraca. And they have found tens of thousands of these. And so you might use a pot, and if the pot broke, you didn't throw the pieces away, you would use that to write on. There are thousands and thousands of these types. And one useful thing, different types of pottery indicate different ages, and so they can help date the writing partly from the type of pottery that it's on. And so that's called ostraca. They also use clay or wax tablets. I don't have pictures of this for you, I should have. Very common. They would have, it would be like a wooden book that you could close up, and there would be wax on both sides, and you could use a little stick to write in the wax. And so students could use this in school. Instead of using a little chalkboard, you write in wax, and then when you're done, you just spread it out and you're all ready to go again. So it was very common. Obviously, it's not necessarily permanent because you can just wipe your hand across it and you've erased it. But they found all kinds of those. Metal was used, such as copper, for example. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of them was made of copper. Wood was written on, leather, and so for the Old Testament documents that have been found, the most common material is leather. So leather is thick, it's pliable. You'd normally just write on one side. The oldest leather scrolls discovered so far date to 1500 BC. So they're 3,500 years old, documents written on leather. And they could sew sheets of leather together with linen thread. Now, coming up to New Testament times, papyrus was the most common material. And papyrus is it's a tall plant that grew along the Nile River. And it has a pulpy center, and the writing material is made from the pulp in the middle of this plant. It's like a reed. So the pith, it's called, would be stripped out of the papyrus plant, and it's cut into thin strips and laid out side by side. And so you'd have two layers using this material from the plant. You lay a whole bunch this way, and then you lay a bunch this way, and you press it down, and they might add some glue, but the juices of the plant itself would cause it to stick together. And so you'd end up basically with a sheet of rough paper. And this material was used for about 600 years. All of the New Testament early documents would have been written on papyrus. These are samples that have been found. A single sheet of papyrus in Greek is called a chartes, and that word occurs in 2 John 12. We get our English word chart from it. A sheet could be used all by itself, kind of like a sheet of paper. Now it'd be rough, and so the side you wrote on was the side where the papyrus was running this way. The back side ran vertically, and it'd be difficult to write on. So papyrus was almost always just written on one side. Occasionally, they would write on the back side, but it's trickier to write on the back side. If you wanted a long document, you would fasten pages of papyrus together into a long roll. Now, the way you commonly see someone using a scroll is all wrong, because they normally show it opening this way. That's not how it worked. It opened this way, always horizontal. Practically, they usually didn't go over 30 feet long. A papyrus scroll is usually 20 to 35 feet long. There was one they've discovered that was 144 feet long. So that'd be, if they say, oh, go back to page 1 to find a certain sentence. Well, okay, give me 2 hours while I roll this thing back. Particularly in New Testament times, where people wanted to look at different verses and stuff, a scroll was utterly inefficient. And so that's when people started, hey, instead of sewing these together into a big long scroll, let's make them into a book called a codex. And you can just flip the pages off. There's a verse on page 1. Instead of taking an hour to wind the thing back and, oh yeah, here it is finally, and then I got to roll it way out. So it's basically because of Christianity that the codex, or what we would call a book, became popular. There was a scribe from ancient Alexandria named Callimachus who said, a big book is a big nuisance. And he was referring to scrolls, that is just a very frustrating thing to deal with. They would arrange the writing, as you may have seen on some of these, typically in a column that was 3 or 4 inches wide. And the scrolls were often stored in pottery jars. So Jeremiah 32:14 says, "This is what the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of Israel, says. Take both this sealed deed and the unsealed copy and put them into a pottery jar to preserve them for a long time." The Dead Sea Scrolls, you might have heard of those, they were in pottery jars. And I mentioned a couple weeks ago about a number of apocryphal works from New Testament times that were discovered in Egypt in 1945. Those were in a big clay pot, and they had been there for 1,600 years, and were still okay when they opened up the pot. Papyrus had started to be used in Egypt as early as 3000 BC. The oldest surviving papyrus fragment we have is from 2400 BC, so that is 4,400 years old, a writing on papyrus like this. It spread and became so popular that by the 4th century BC, it was the predominant writing material. If you're going to write anything from about the 4th century BC up to about AD 300, you were going to write it on papyrus. Unfortunately, papyrus, being a plant-based material, it's not going to last forever. If it's exposed to moisture and light, it will break down. And so most of the papyrus manuscripts we have been discovered in Egypt, where they have a very dry climate. The other thing that happened,
When
question?
we were in Israel, I noticed the Dead Sea Scrolls are displayed with fluorescent light behind them. So is that going to cause more rapid deterioration?
well, they probably have special lighting to protect them. As I recall, in that room, it was not real bright.
Right, I agree.
And they didn't have any sunlight in there either.
Right,
It'd be UV rays from the sunlight would cause it to deteriorate.
okay.
By about AD 300, the production of papyrus, which only came from Egypt, could not keep up with the demand for writing material. And so it was generally replaced by something called parchment. So now we're going to talk about parchment or vellum. As papyrus couldn't keep up with the demand, it was basically replaced by parchment. Parchment is similar to leather, but different. And so here's a guy preparing parchment. You take an animal skin, you stretch it out, you scrape the fur off one side, and you would treat it with various chemicals. They would wet it and then scrape it and dry it a number of times. If you have a leather coat, it's supple. Parchment is a lot stiffer. It's whiter than leather. It's thinner than leather, but it's less supple than leather, and it, if treated properly, will last for hundreds of years. Parchment, as we've seen here, started to replace papyrus as early as the 3rd century. It started to replace leather as early as the 3rd century BC. Parchment and vellum. Vellum is a type of parchment. It's a form of refined leather. Vellum came from the skin of calves or antelopes. Parchment came from the skins of sheep and goats. Vellum, as I said, is a type of parchment. It's like a very luxurious, high-class parchment. For more than 1,000 years, from about AD 300 to 1400, so that's 1,100 years, if you were going to write something down in that time period from about AD 300 to AD 1400, you wrote it on parchment. So I said the New Testament was originally written on papyrus, but as it was copied years later, they copied it onto parchment. You may have seen some in there. Did some come across where the parchment had been dyed purple? That's high-class stuff. To dye the parchment purple, and then they would normally use silver ink to write on it. And so you have purple writing material and then silver or sometimes gold ink. Now, interestingly, in the United States, here's 3 documents that are written on parchment. because they want them to last for hundreds or thousands of years. One is called the Declaration of Independence, one is called the Constitution, and one is called the Bill of Rights. They're all written on parchment. They will be around in a couple thousand years still. Paper will disintegrate. Parchment was very valuable. It's made from animal skin, and so the supply is somewhat limited. It's not cheap. We have numerous copies of the New Testament that are in palimpsest form. What that means is someone wrote a portion of the New Testament on parchment, and then maybe 300 years later, someone else decided, I want to reuse this parchment, and so they would try to erase the original writing, and then they might turn it 90 degrees, and they'd write something new over top what was originally written there. I've got a lot of pictures. Some of them are hard to see, and so in the past, scientists would use various chemicals in an attempt. And so if you look carefully at most of these, I'll talk a little bit about it. So I said they used to use chemicals to try to bring out the underwriting. Now they use ultraviolet photography, infrared photography. I recently had a camera converted to be an infrared camera. They will use X-rays, and they will use various computer programs to try to bring out the writing that's underneath the top writing. So we're trying to get at the bottom writing. There's quite a few. I think I've got probably 20 examples there, Tim, in a folder. So these are, you can imagine what textual scholars would go through when you see some of these pictures, trying to somehow bypass the upper writing in order to see the underwriting that they had attempted to erase.
Robert, I noticed in what we were looking at a minute ago that there appeared to be no capitals or small letters, no punctuation. How would you decipher what was being said?
It's a tremendous difficulty. I'm coming to that.
Okay.
Paper, the Chinese were making paper as early as the 2nd century BC. Interestingly, in the middle of the 8th century AD, some Arabs captured some Chinese prisoners who taught them how to make paper. Gradually, paper making spread until the time of about the 13th century. Paper started being used in Europe. Up until then, it had been initially papyrus and then parchment. Now we're going to talk about writing instruments and ink. If you were going to engrave writing on a stone, you would just use a hammer and a chisel. If you're writing on clay, wet clay or wax, you'd use a wooden or a metal stylus. Early ink pens were actually like a little paintbrush, a fine paintbrush, depending on how you could make broad strokes or thin strokes. And they were actually made from a reed that had been slit, so there's like little bristles on the end. And then eventually reed pens began to be used, and they were just a reed that was cut to a point and with a slit that would store some ink, and you'd have to dip it in ink regularly. Pens like that were used for hundreds of years to write on papyrus in particular. Quill pens made out of a feather came along later. The best ones came from geese or swans, but they were also made from the feathers of crows, eagles, owls, hawks, and turkeys, any big bird. They started being used as early as the 3rd century BC, but they didn't really become popular until about the 6th century. If you're going to sharpen your pen, you would use a pen knife. There's a special little type of knife, and some people still refer to a pocket knife as a pen knife. It was used to sharpen your pen. So the tip would wear down, and then you had to cut a new tip on it, off the feather. So a quill pen, that's a feather pen, worked better on parchment. And so as parchment became more popular, so a reed pen was used on papyrus. When they switched to parchment, they discovered a quill pen worked better on parchment.
So, Bob, are you going to talk about the differences between papyrus and parchment coming up?
I already did that.
Oh,
But you
okay,
missed
I'll
it.
catch up
Yeah, so the difference was papyrus is made from a plant and it's bumpy, and they couldn't keep up with the demand, and so it switched to papyrus, which is a form of refined leather. And we had pictures. Interestingly, for about a 1300 year period, if you were going to write something, you used a feather to do it. A quill pen from about the 6th century up to the 1800s. Metal pens started being produced in 1822. Prior to 1822, which is only 200 years ago, if you were going to write something, you used a feather to do it. And I won't bore you with all the details. Certain feathers were prized, where it came, which wing, the left wing was preferred, and the order of the feathers. They could charge you different amounts. All the pictures we see of people using a quill pen are all wrong, because usually they stripped all the feather portion off, maybe just left the tuft on the end, but in the pictures you see in movies and so on, they leave the actual feather there. They just were interested with the middle. Now the ink they used was a compound of charcoal or black carbon, gum or oil, and water. They sometimes used metallic substances. More expensive ink was black. Less expensive ink was brown. And ink was often stored just as a dried substance. You'd wet your pen and then poke it in the dried powder. We're going to look at palimpsest manuscripts. There's a lot of New Testament documents. Some of these ones with weird colors are where they've used different like ultraviolet or infrared or X-rays to try to decipher the writing that's underneath. And so you can see, just stop there, Tim. The original document, the writing went this way, and when they reused it, they rotated it 90 degrees and wrote right over top it. And they attempted to erase the original stuff. Well, the original thing might have been from the New Testament in the year 300. The later one might be Steve Sweetman's poem or bluegrass song that he wrote in 1,000 years later.
Does he have a banjo up there?
And so, obviously, whoever wrote over top it valued what they were writing more than what was underneath. I think the
And
bottom
what
was the
language are
same.
we looking at?
Well, this looks like Coptic from Egypt, but you can see, I think they've used maybe infrared light here to help the underwriting show up better. You can see the new writing goes at right angles to the original writing. So it was extremely common, and so we have a lot of New Testament documents that are very ancient that are the underwriting, where someone wrote over top them, wrote their bluegrass song over top it.
So they would preserve that paper to reuse?
Well,
it?
the parchment was very expensive, and so they wouldn't just throw it away. They would erase the original, or try to, and then reuse it. Very commonly done. It's made out of animal skin. And so compared to leather, it's thinner than leather, it's whiter than leather, and it's stiffer than leather. But it would last as long as leather, in different colored ink there.
And they would use the hide of all different types of animals? Or
Sheep, goats, calves, antelope. Now, not all the documents I'm showing you here had the New Testament underneath, but these are just examples of palimpsest documents. And some of them, like this one, photographed in, there's one there that had triple, different types of lighting or computer programming trying to decipher what's written underneath. They would rotate the document. As they rotated it, you could see the underwriting or the surface writing. So it's fascinating. So imagine the work you have to go through. You're trying to read John's Gospel written in 300 AD. Meanwhile, you're trying to ignore the peppy bluegrass song written over top it in 1500. Here's they're using some like ultraviolet light or something trying to decipher it.
Wow.
The previous one, was it you were interested in?
No,
Peggy?
the purple one.
Oh, okay, yeah. So this is where they've used ultraviolet light or something like that in an attempt. You can see the original writing is running up and down this way.
could
and
it
so-
have even been a dye, Robert, that they're using to
They used to use that, but the dye is a little destructive. They've used various chemicals, ammonia and stuff, to try to bring out, and so they've discovered in modern times, photography has really helped. So infrared photography, which is a wavelength beyond what our eyes can see. Ultraviolet photography, which is also a wavelength on the other end of what our eyes can see. X-rays we know about. And then various computer type imaging. So here's an example. The blue is the writing, the one on the right is ultraviolet or something like that. And Mayadar is a type of computer imaging that they do. It takes great dedication to spend, maybe years studying this thing, trying to decipher the document that's underneath. So that's what they would go through. Now I'm going to talk about the dating of documents briefly.
Robert, who would be the ones assigned to do that? Like scholars of some sort, I guess? Or
Yeah, well, there's various universities. It's interesting, if you read a list of all the ancient New Testament documents, they have this book, for example. He lists hundreds of New Testament manuscripts, and for each one he says where it is. So this one's in Oxford University, this one's at the University of Michigan, this one's in a museum in Cairo, this one's in Germany, and so a person would have to travel around the whole world to see all these. They're not gathered in one spot. But the internet has certainly helped. A lot of these are published on the internet, so a person can study them. The guy who wrote this book has traveled all around the world, and he says, I've held this one in my hands, and so on. This guy is Philip Wesley Comfort. I've read quite a few books by him. He's quite a textual scholar. I'm going to mention briefly a scientific thing called Paleo Graphy, which is the study of ancient handwriting. And so this is one of the methods used to study handwriting, and by looking at the handwriting you can tell when this document was written. Even if you think about English, if I come across some letters written by my mother or one of my aunts, written in the 50s, I can tell you they wrote different in the 50s than people write now. Of course, students now, they don't even know how to write. They use a keyboard. In the school board, you learn how to print, but people no longer learn cursive writing because it's a waste of time. You just use a keyboard. But back in the 50s, and prior to that, they studied handwriting. And so my mother had very meticulous, pretty to look at handwriting versus today. The same thing with biblical documents. And so this book, I've read this, he talks about all these major New Testament manuscripts, and he talks about the writing style in each one. Oh, this one is from the early 200s. That one's probably from 250 because the writing's different. This one's probably from between 280 and 300 because the writing's different. And so they have studied in great detail the way writing changed decade by decade, and by looking at it, they know when it was written. Some other ways they can date documents is archaeology. If they find a document, for example, in a clay pot, styles of clay pots changed over the decades and centuries, and so that can help date it. Or they might find a coin or something near it. And also radiocarbon 14 dating is useful, and it will measure the amount of radioactive carbon remaining in an organic object and will give an approximate age. I'm going to talk briefly about some manuscripts of the New Testament this time. The word manuscript means it was written by hand. Anything up to at least 1454 was written by hand, and probably even 100 years after that, they were still copying manuscripts by hand. We're going to get into some of the complications of that later. Thousands and thousands of early Christian manuscripts were destroyed because of persecution. Roman empires made it a point, if we're going to stamp out Christianity, we must destroy every copy of anything of the New Testament we can find. Yes?
I'm sorry, what year did you say that they changed from writing to?
1454, the printing press was invented in the West. And so, but it was still expensive. Remember I said the Gutenberg Bible, the first Bible ever printed, it would cost you $150,000 to buy a Bible in today's money. Later on, by the time of the Geneva Bible, they printed so many and costs had come down, it would only cost you $1,000 to buy a Bible in today's money. And so people who could afford it, hey, $1,000 is a lot cheaper than $150,000 for a Bible, and so that was the most popular Bible up till that time. So getting back to manuscripts, part of the reason we don't have every manuscript ever written that related to Christianity was because of persecution. First by the Romans, they did the best to stamp out Christianity and destroyed every document they could find. Second wave of destruction, the Muslims. As Islam came into power, they tried to stamp out Christianity as well by destroying documents. We're going to talk briefly about Greek manuscripts. We have about 5,700 Greek manuscripts that include either all or a portion of the New Testament. And these date from the early 2nd century up until the 15th century. Basically, once the printing press came along, manuscripts faded away. I talked about papyri. The earliest manuscripts obviously were written on papyrus. We have about 115 manuscripts written on papyrus. These were written from the 2nd to the 4th century when papyrus faded away. Obviously, many more than that were written, but they've all rotted away. All the ones we had came from Egypt, where the dry climate preserved them. These are all written in uncial letters. I have a folder to show you what uncial writing looks like. I'm going to pass a sample around. So if you're a textual scholar attempting to reconstruct the Greek manuscript, uncial writing is all capital letters. There's no spaces between any words. There's no paragraphs. There's no punctuation. This document I'm passing around is Romans chapter 8, written the way it's obviously in English, but that's an uncial manuscript with no spaces, no punctuation, no capitals. And so there's a good example. No spaces between words. Everything's capital letters. Oh, and there was one of the fancy ones, purple parchment with silver letters. This would have been, that's extremely expensive, and so this would have been produced for a king, probably. In fact, I read about one, it was, I think, produced for the Tsar of Russia, with purple vellum and silver letters.
And what was this, how would they create the silver?
They would actually put little specks of silver in the ink. So it's literally silver ink. Also, to keep the columns straight, you notice how the columns are straight? You don't finish a word if it's going to poke out. The word carries on to the next line. And so that's what I've done in this uncial manuscript that's going around. We have more than 40 of these papyrus manuscripts that are prior to the year 300, including a number from the 2nd century. So that's between the year 100 and 200 we have manuscripts. Obviously there's no verses, no numbers. The first edition of the Bible that ever had verse numbers was published in 1551. For 1500 years you may do without verses. Next we're going to talk about, it's a little confusing because papyrus manuscripts were written in uncial letters. However, there's another whole group of documents, manuscripts, called uncials. We're still in the uncial section. What this refers to, these are manuscripts that are written on parchment, but they're written in uncial letters, which tells you their age, because at some point uncial writing fades away and is replaced by another style of writing. But first let me talk about uncials. It is confusing. The first group are called papyri. They're written in uncial writing. The second group are called uncials, merely because they're printed on parchment with uncial writing. They might have been called that before any papyri had even been discovered. So parchment replaced papyri around AD 300 and lasted for 1100 years until about 1400 when it was replaced by paper. We have over 300 of these uncial manuscripts written in uncial print on parchment. They date from the 4th century to the 10th century, and we have about 30 of them that are written on pottery. So we call that ostraca.
Robert, is it known, did the people talk like that, like without inflection? And
No, they talk just like us. It's to save, parchment's expensive.
Okay,
So why would you waste a space without putting a letter
okay.
there? It's just the style. We'll be talking about textual criticism. We're hoping to get into that next week. One of the problems of figuring out what Paul wrote is because there's no spaces. And so there's lots of opportunities where a person copying might make a mistake, or a person reading it, well, does that E, is that the first letter of this word, or is that the last letter of that word? And it can change the words. And there's many opportunities for that mistake to occur. The three oldest and most complete of the uncial manuscripts that we have, one was discovered in 1630, and two of them were discovered in the 1800s. A key date we talked about a number of weeks ago was the King James Bible came out in 1611. The three best manuscripts we have of the New Testament were all discovered after the King James came out. All of the papyri, which we saw some sample pictures of, they were all discovered after the King James came out.
And who discovered them?
Oh, various scientists, archaeologists, that went looking for them. Now we're going to talk about something minuscules, they're called. 90% of all the New Testament manuscripts we have are minuscules, which are written like this. It's more cursive writing. That's a minuscule there. Minuscule writing is different than uncial writing. Uncial writing is all capital letters. It did change over the years. It's fascinating to read about the size of the letters, the shape of the letters, the tilt of the letters. That's what a paleographist would look at to tell the age of it. Minuscule writing is cursive writing, the type that children no longer learn, where you would write in smaller letters and you can actually join one letter to another. So instead of printing, you are now writing, if you understand the difference there. Minuscule writing or cursive writing actually existed around 300 BC, but it was not used for literary formal works. It was, if you jot your grocery list down, you would use cursive writing. But let me just make sure I got the dates right. Around the 9th to 10th century, so we're talking the 800s and 900s AD, documents switched gradually from writing in capital letters to writing in small letters. And so that's instantly you can tell this is not an older document because it's written in lowercase rather than uppercase. So the two categories I gave you first, the papyri and the uncials, those are the oldest documents. It's going to be very important when we talk about textual criticism. All the minuscules, which are 90% of the manuscripts we have, they are written in this cursive style of writing. And so that means they're from the 9th century or later than that.
And that's in a different language, correct? You said it was written cursive,
Yeah, but it's Greek still.
right here. Greek cursive?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
And see, that was actually dated, that's 1022
Okay.
that was written. And it's in cursive writing. As of 1999, we have approaching 3,000 of these minuscule manuscripts. I've already talked about palimpsest documents. Now, many of these manuscripts are just portions. We're not talking about, in most cases, a whole New Testament. It might be one book. They circulated in groups of books. The Gospels, and that was a big enough book. Or the letters of Paul, that was a big enough book. If you had the whole New Testament, we're talking something that's all handwritten on parchment pages, it's going to be big. It might weigh 50 pounds. And so it's not a pocket New Testament we're talking about here.
Robert, when current groups translate the Bible, do they look at both of these?
You look at everything. And that's what I'm going to be talking about next week. Now I'm just going to talk about, I'm going to give you one quote and then I'm going to pass out a page to you. This Sir Frederick Kenyon said, he's a Greek manuscript scholar, and he wrote in 1940, quote, "The interval between the dates of original composition and the earliest extant evidence becomes so small as to be in fact negligible. And the last foundation for any doubt that the scriptures have come down to us substantially as they were written has now been resolved. Both the authenticity and the general integrity of the books of the New Testament may be regarded as finally established." And part of what he was talking about, I'm going to pass this sheet out to you, and I'm going to compare other ancient writing to the New Testament in this case. I'm going to talk about the date of composition of a document, the number of manuscripts we have of that document, and the gap in years from when it was written to the earliest manuscripts. Homer. Who's heard of Homer? Not Homer Simpson.
Yes.
Not Homer Simpson, though. He wrote a number of books. One's called the Iliad. He wrote it in 800 BC. We have 643 manuscripts of the Iliad. The one closest in time, we have a little fragment that's within 400 years of when he wrote it. The first complete copy is more than 2,000 years after he wrote it. No one questions the authenticity of the Iliad. Herodotus was a famous historian. He wrote between 480 and 425 BC. We have 8 manuscripts of the book he wrote. The closest one in time is 1,350 years after he wrote his book. Thucydides, also a historian, he wrote between 460 and 400 BC. We have 8 manuscripts of his book. The closest one in time is 1,300 years after he wrote it. Plato, famous philosopher, wrote around 400 BC. We have 7 manuscripts of his works. The closest one in time is 1,300 years after he wrote. Demosthenes wrote in 300 BC. We have 200 manuscripts of his works. The closest one in time is 1,400 years after he wrote. Julius Caesar wrote a book called the Gallic Wars. He wrote between 100 and 44 BC. We have 10 manuscripts of that book. The closest one in time is 1,000 years after he wrote. A Roman historian called Livy wrote between 59 BC and AD 17. We have 20 manuscripts. We have a little fragment of one of his documents that's 400 years after he wrote, and more complete manuscripts are over 1,000 years after he wrote. Tacitus, a historian, wrote around AD 100. We have 20 manuscripts of his writing. The closest one in time is 1,000 years after he wrote. The New Testament was written between about AD 50 and 90. We have 5,700 manuscripts. We have fragments that are less than 50 years after the original book was written. We have a whole book that's within 100 years after it was written. We have most of the New Testament within 150 years, and we have a complete New Testament within 225 years. If you compare that with the other examples here or any other ancient document, the New Testament is the best attested document from history that exists. It's just incredible how many manuscripts have survived and how close in time, especially the fact we have a fragment of a manuscript within 50 years of when it was originally written. It's just astonishing compared to others that are 1,400 years gap. I thought it would be worth your while to have that in your hand. If anyone ever questions the reliability of the manuscripts of the New Testament, show them this page. Because no one questions, well, what did Homer write? Or what did Plato write? Or what did Julius Caesar write? When there's a gap of many centuries, and here we have gaps down to 100 years. Any questions? That's it for tonight.